Hello, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the short break as much as I did, hanging out with Jamie and Michael here. Wanted to give a quick update on the leaderboard for our points. Looks like Yay, Nay, Mark, Fernando, and Jillian are in the top 5 spots. Looks like it's still anybody's game in there, so keep after it, everyone. Loving the engagement and activity. So we've been talking about cyber threat intelligence, and now we're sort of moving into the test and evaluation phase of the triangle of threat-informed defense. And in this talk, we're going to sort of get into the purple teaming aspect, which definitely connects all 3 points of the triangle. So Jamie's going to be our facilitator and moderator here. Jamie, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And obviously, thanks for having us. And hopefully, everyone's having an excellent conference. Congrats to the points winners. Normally we give these talks, and like sometimes there might be CPE credit or something. It's kind of exciting to tether this to points as well. But yeah, as Steve said, we're going to talk a little bit. I know Mike and Govardhan earlier introduced and kind of outlined a lot of what we think about for adversary emulation. So we figured it'd be kind of a cool talk to talk about, how that applies to other big concepts you might have heard, such as purple teaming. But most importantly, it's like really cool to understand these topics and really appreciate them. But how do you actually bring that into your environment? So hopefully the 3 of us can share some lessons learned from our experience. Oh, slide flip works. That's awesome. So, as introduced, my name is Jamie Williams. I've been at MITRE for about 4 years, working on various things associated with MITRE ATT&CK, purple teaming, adversary emulation. Coming from more of an offensive background, but definitely learning and trying to, every day grow my chops in the blue defensive side, as well as intel analysis. And just for, fun trivia, my favorite elephant is definitely Snuffy. Hard character not to rally behind. Apparently, for anyone who is not familiar, Sesame Street, I think he was an imaginary friend for a while. They ended up revealing that he was real. So kind of interesting backstory there. And I'll turn it over to Mike and Steve to kind of give you at least their favorite elephant.
Jamie, I think you were supposed to say spoiler alert before you revealed that.
Oh, sorry. It's late. It's late in the show.
For those who haven't seen the whole Sesame Street canon yet.
Well, thanks, Jamie. So, yeah, my name's Michael Long. If you joined me for the morning session, you saw that I do adversary emulation all day long. So, really excited to kind of talk about how we model and emulate different threats in the context of this talk. Elephant-wise, I figure Horton reigns supreme. I believe he was acted brilliantly by Jim Carrey in one of the films. Also, as a parent of 2 small children, I find myself reading lots of Dr. Seuss. So, for me, Horton was no contest.
Nice trivia there. I didn't know Carrie played Horton. I'm going to check that out. Sounds awesome.
Nice. I'm Steve Luke. I've been your host today, so you've probably seen my little face many times today. I am the director of content for MITRE ATT&CK Defender. So I've been working with Jamie and Michael and all of the other MAD professors to develop the educational content and assessments that we've got with MAD. And the way I got into that is I've been working with ATT&CK and figuring out, how best to apply ATT&CK for defense for quite a long time, and been working with various different organizations, teaching them how to build analytics based on attack technique knowledge, and doing purple teams with them, including one, at least one with Jamie. That was really fun live. So we're going to be talking about that later. And, I think Michael and Jamie picked some great elephants there. Elmer, I think, spoke to me because it's sort of this, idea of a conglomeration of a lot of different diverse perspectives, which I think is very appropriate for this in a few different ways. One is that I feel like cyber is still in a period of creative innovation. And in order to get creativity, you really need a lot of different perspectives to come together and fuse those. And that's when you really get creative solutions. So I think that's really important. 2 is that I think, the things that I'm going to be talking about today and have applied to all of this MAD work really reflect not only my own ideas, but things that I've learned from so many other great people like Jamie and Michael, but others as well who aren't here on this conference today, like Roman and Dan Ellis and Willie Cooper Sannon and so many others who have taught and influenced and mentored me. So, it takes a team to come up with really good ideas. And I think there's a sense, this myth of the lone genius who comes up with stuff. And I don't think anyone's trying to apply that to me, but I do want to, explicitly acknowledge all the different people who have contributed to this. And then finally, for purple teaming, that's kind of what purple teaming is really capitalizing on, is bringing people with the adversary emulation background and the people who have the security, threat hunting, analytic development background. And when you get those two groups together, there's a magic that happens in the intersection there that we're going to talk about here today.
Yep. And I don't know if Mike, if we have any stance to disagree, but I think Steve definitely wins the award for most nuanced and most, actually heartfelt explanation of an elephant. Love that. But yeah, I think just to kind of outline what we're going to do today, we'll give you just some slides and some tips, kind of walking through our experiences, maybe some interesting conversation. But towards the end, we will open up to, open-ended questions. I think we'll end up, kind of, talking to each other, maybe just kind of sussing out ideas, but also an invitation for anyone, watching, if they want to inject any questions. This is, 100% live. So feel free to submit questions and we can, address those. But like Steve said, I think the big starting point is understanding the terms, understanding what is purple team, what is adversary emulation, and most importantly, what can it do for you? How do you apply this into your environment? What kind of problems are you trying to solve? So I really like what you said, Steve, about, purple teaming being, appreciating these different skill sets and merging them together. The other big thing, just kind of kicking off this conversation from my experience is, purple teaming isn't just, putting the red teamers and the blue teamers in the same room, checking that box that they're talking. It's really an attitude and approach, like whether you're coming from it from that right side, that very offensive perspective, or you're just a sysadmin and you do the very blue side. It really is. Purple teaming is going to, thrive when you're not just doing your side. You're thinking about the middle. You're, as an offensive engineer, you're thinking, hey, what effect does this have on the system? How would it possibly be detected? How do I best explain what I'm doing to the other side that they can act on it? Understanding that other side's practices, what do they see? How do they act on it? How do they feel about the things they see? And the inverse. So it's, no matter who you are, whether you're in the intel side, I can't see the triangle. It's a little small there, but whether tip of that pyramid or tip of that triangle you're on, you do have a really important role and a really interesting perspective to kind of add to this purple team magic. But so purple teaming, hopefully we're covering that. And if there's any questions, definitely feel free to inject them. But, the other big term that we're introducing, or kind of, one of the baselines of our conversation today, will be adversary emulation. So I know Michael and Govardhan did a really great job introducing, this concept earlier. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Mike real quick for just a quick recap on, adversary emulation. What is it? And, what are the key points, leading into a more nuanced conversation?
Yeah, so in the simplest sense, adversary emulation is really about executing adversary TTPs based on real world observations. To try and unpack that a little bit, when we talk about real world observations, oftentimes that takes the form of cyber threat intelligence, the kind that you could find listed on ATT&CK, vendor articles, or even internally. So the fact is, we're leveraging our available intelligence to inform how we do offensive assessments. Now, the reason why this is impractical is because, there's so many different types of assessments, vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, traditional red teaming. And a question we have to ask as network defenders is, are these assessments representative of real world threats? Oftentimes, the answer is no. And when we start to think about that, it really just means that we're spending a lot of time and effort on these kinds of assessments for comparatively minimal value. So with adversary emulation, we're really using real-world adversary TTPs in order to ensure that our assessments are representative of real-world threats, basically operationalizing that idea of threat-informed defense. And in that way, we gain a much better understanding and are therefore able to better improve our cyber security. Last thing I'll say with respect to adversary emulation is when we talk about modeling real world threats, it enables us to prioritize our assessment results. As an example, It's one thing if we run a Nessus scan, you get 1,000 vulnerabilities, not really prioritized. Maybe you get some criticals, some mediums and lows and so on. But what are you going to do with a 1,000 page Nessus report? It's pretty hard to work with. On the other hand, if you run a 10-step adversary emulation plan and all of those steps are no kidding based on actual activity occurring in the wild right now, that is a lot easier to kind of prioritize and reason about. So in that way, we're just kind of supporting more impactful assessments overall.
And I love that what you said about the prioritization is, even every one of our roles, no matter who you are, there's so many decisions you have to make. Because, if you're as an intel analyst, there's reports about different CVEs, different actors, all these different TTPs. How do you actually distill that down to, what matters most either day? And even from the blue side, you go to any analytic repository and, look at an attack. There's so many different techniques to maybe focus on, so many different procedures and all these variations. And I know Steve is going to talk on this later, but how do you actually answer those questions with, what should I be doing right now? What's the, tip of the iceberg? What's the most important thing to me right now? So, prioritization is going to be one of those things that's kind of transcends most of these acts and practices that we're using. But exactly as Mike said, we can use that threat informed mentality to kind of help steer and maybe answer those questions. And I love what you said, Mike. Adversary emulation, it's not a one-stop shop. There's not a right way to do it. There's not a wrong way to do it. It's really this culture and this attitude of whether I'm doing a red team, a pen test, a vulnerability assessment, even a tabletop exercise where, we're just sitting down and saying, hey, what would happen if an actor executed ransomware in our environment? How would we respond to that? What would be our next steps? Who would be involved and who would be the decision makers? Whatever you're doing, as long as you're, there's so much wealth and so much power in incorporating, as you said, cyber threat intelligence into that process, making those questions, making those answers informed by, what we actually know about our adversaries, how they operate, why they operate, timelines, all those questions, are so much more enriched by an understanding of our adversary. And so I really love what you're saying in terms of just the breadth of adversary emulation. But I had a particular question for you here is, can you give some examples of, how you've, varied adversary emulation based on a different use case? Like a good example here would be, maybe a red team versus an atomic test. And I know Steve has also done some work here with, purple teaming, maybe iteratively targeting, very specific things. Vice, maybe a broad assessment, almost like an OSINT to, initial access versus, hey, let's just test credential dumping for an hour. What's kind of your thoughts here on, varying how you actually apply adversary emulation to kind of fit that need?
Was that directed at me, Jamie? I apologize. My audio cut out slightly.
I think
Sorry, go ahead. First, Mike? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll go first. So varying adversary emulation for different use cases is pretty interesting. So if we think about tabletop exercises, that's a pretty common request we get from a lot of different sponsors, government stakeholders, and so on. Tabletop exercises, they could be beneficial in that they have relatively lower complexity and perhaps level of effort compared to, say, an end-to-end red team. It's really easy to throw people in the room for a day, propose scenarios, discuss hypotheticals. When it comes to adversary emulation for tabletop exercises, usually what we try to emphasize is bringing that realism. And the reason for that is because the problem with tabletops, a lot of discussions are kind of predicated on assumptions. It's predicated on knowing what your network looks like, how it's configured, how effective your security controls are. So adversary emulation is kind of a counterbalance to that. It's okay, let's assume our understanding is accurate. Let's use real world adversary behaviors to kind of guide how that tabletop exercise will be structured. Now, the flip side of that is you can get a lot of good discussions and benefits out of a tabletop. What I really like to do is take the results of that and then validate those assumptions, say either in atomic testing or in red teaming. So now you're actually putting hands on keyboard and confirming, were those things we discussed true? And if not, what were some of the problems that kind of resulted, I guess, in those incorrect assumptions? So bottom line is it's very much a pendulum that can kind of swing different ways. And there's a lot of different ways you can kind of tailor adversary emulation to your use case.
I love that response because, like you said, there's a maturity model here where everyone you want to. It seems interesting, and you're like, I want to bring a red team in. I'm ready for this testing. But if you can't, if you don't have just the basics and maybe the basic hygiene, maybe basic practices, already stable and executing your environment, it might not be worth your time. If you don't have a good idea of the data you're sensing, where it flows, and who's responsible for it, what systems your environment. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered before you can actually proceed to adversary emulation. So, we can, I think it's maybe case by organization, but taking those steps to kind of make sure you kind of have all those ducks in line before you dive straight in. And maybe, you don't want a red team going up with, no kind of opponent. And it looks like we're getting some really great questions. So I do want to address a couple of these before we proceed. But one that I think, Steve, you already kind of addressed in the chat here, but someone asked, how do you go into picking an adversary or actually the target of your emulation? And I think it aligns directly what we're talking about with kind of that maturity model of maybe start and build into something. But Steve, I wanted to open up if you wanted to share any thoughts there.
Yeah. So before I do, I just want to go back to something Michael said on the last slide, which I think is important to reinforce, because like 15 years ago, a lot of red teaming was win at all costs in order to prove to the network owner that it was possible to own them. And one of the problems with that was that at the end, the network owner could plausibly say, and often did, yeah, but that's not what real adversaries would be able to do. You are some advanced team that's come in here with these bespoke tools that you've created. Not everybody's going to have that, right? And so they could sort of dismiss the results in a way. Also, as the red team, I think they felt very protective and sort of secretive of their capabilities because they were bespoke tools that they had created just for this engagement, and they didn't want to burn those. And they were worried about something that Michael talked about this morning, which was defenses that are tailored just for their tool, right? And just to block their tool, and then that's going to make them do all this rework to get back in, right? And so it set up a really bad dynamic. And I think basing it on real threat actors and what they actually do helps to solve both of those problems. So to get to your question, Jamie, from the chat here, I think, of course, if a particular organization has one adversary or a handful that they are most concerned about, they have some special intel that tells them that's the adversary that's going to target us, then that makes sense to use those in your adversary emulation. But if you've got some flexibility, I think what we have found in our purple teaming activities is that if you can start with maybe a louder adversary, someone who isn't trying as hard to cover their tracks and is maybe using some techniques that might be easier to detect, that could be a good starting point for an organization. You were talking about the maturity model, right? You want to sort of be prepared for the emulation that's about to happen on your network. And the concept with purple teaming is that you're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of some defensive concepts or measures that you have in place. And so you kind of want to pick an adversary that will help you evaluate those things. And then maybe you sort of can graduate up to stealthier, more evasive adversaries who use techniques that might be more difficult to detect. Once you've sort of established, we know how to do a purple team, we're collecting the right kind of data, we've established a relationship between the two teams, and they're collaborating effectively.
What you said, because it's almost a segue to our next topic of, as practitioners, say we're dropped into a random secure operations center or, helping out a particular unit, where do we start? Like, what questions do you start to ask? And as we talked about, it's all about rethinking, adversary emulation, purple teaming, and actually operationalize this. It's all about rethinking the way, we actually want to, deploy and plan our red teams. And I think this actually starts to address some of the questions we're seeing trickling in. But exactly as you said, Steve, it's, for every assessment, we can't just go in blind. We have to think about, what are we trying to assess? Are we looking at, particular technology stacks? Are there particular, people? Are we going against hunters versus IR versus real-time responders? Are we going against, trying to see how our forensic team work? Or are we targeting processes? Are we targeting, how well does, a frontline SOC worker communicate, remediations back to an engineer or whoever the next, level 2 layer is? We have to, we really have to understand, what are we trying to do? But most importantly, next bullet, next, logical topic would be, how do we measure that? Is it based on time? Is it based on coverage? What are those metrics that matter? Not only is that we can scope and, kind of plan and build a better assessment, but actually during the evaluation, we actually know what to look for. We know what, we have a baseline of expectations on. I think someone asked about that cyber hygiene, that kind of, if you don't know what you are detecting, you don't know how to assess it. Starting from nothing and going to something is a little bit impossible. And we can use all of that to answer that third bullet of, is an APT3 the best emulation for me? Is an APT29, a Fin7, a Fin6, Fin13, whatever, pick your favorite. All of those questions are going to compound on top of each other and hopefully lead you to a better answer and kind of form and drive that decision. So, just a question for you folks, how have you gone about, working with a customer or working with yourself to kind of begin to write down, document, and start thinking through these problems?
Well, one thing I wanted to touch on a question, I think it's totally connected to what you just said. There's a question in the chat about adversary intent. How do you take that into account? One of the things that I've done with organizations is we talk through what are their unacceptable losses? What are their failure scenarios that they are most worried about? What are their crown jewels that they're most worried about? And then we can start from there as like, that's the target that we're worried about protecting and that we think an adversary might go after, and then work our way back out. So in order to achieve that mission effect, because remember that adversaries are operating in the real world, they're trying to achieve some real world effect, and cyber is just the means to the ends for them. So if we can start with what's that real world effect that they're going after, what's their intent, and then we can work our way backward and say, what cyber thing would they have to do to make that effect happen? And then what cyber thing would they have to do to make that possible, right? And you can go back and create links in the chain until you get to some point where it's like, oh, well, that's initial access. And now we've kind of backwards created an attack path that we know it would end up with that big mission impact that we're worried about at the end. And so I think that helps focus us.
That's a really great point too, because with these adversary emulation engagements or these plans, we're not building, we're not directly simulating or doing a precise replication of the adversary by emulating a hypothetical scenario, which, as you said, we can kind of define, the intent. We can, scope it to what we most need and kind of bake in, in hypothetical senses, bake an adversary into our environment and our needs and our data and kind of have them fulfill our, what we want from this assessment. That's a really excellent point. Second point too, and I'm glad you touched on this, was, if only we had this magical framework that helped us like understand each behavior and chain them together and kind of see the bigger picture and, why an adversary would actually do something in the different means. That would be, quite a crazy idea.
If only such a thing existed.
But yeah, Mike, in your experience, I know you've done quite a few of these assessments. I know does it start with an email? Does it start with a call, a Slack message? How do you begin to probe customers into like, not starting with day one of just show up, do your emulation and go? Like, how do you actually tease this information out of a customer to say, hey, I need you to tell me about your defenses. What are you looking for? How do you actually, kind of elicit this information from someone who's interested and being, adversary emulated?
Well, usually this interest, it usually starts from some kind of concern. Some of the common ones that we see could be the government might have a contractor that's building something for them, some new solution, uh, some kind of information technology, right? So the government has something being built for them, and they could very reasonably ask, how do we know that this piece of technology is secure? That's usually the first question that kind of starts us down this path. And anytime a network owner wants to know, how do we know this thing is secure? That could be a good opportunity to start considering adversary emulation. There's a lot of preliminary things you can do before that. I talked about the Nessus scan approach. You've got other capabilities like fortify scans, manual code reviews. There's a lot of different things you can do, and they all have different kind of benefits and trade-offs based on your maturity. Typically, kind of the way I like to spin it is it's probably good to kind of start with like the foundational low hanging fruit. Start by looking at the technology, understand what data does it process, how is it configured, how could it be reasonably expected to change over time. After that, you're in a good point to start doing some of those dynamic or automated scans, Nessus scans, Fortify scans, and so on. That's all the easy stuff. After you've kind of knocked all those out, you're probably ready to start doing some more representative adversary modeling, emulating specific behaviors, or maybe you're taking some good red teamers in an isolated environment and seeing, well, how far can they get? And really, the whole takeaway there is that there's a lot of different approaches you can apply to this. Every different assessment approach has its own benefits and trade offs. And at the end of the day, you just got to kind of pick the one that works best for your organization and your use case.
And I really like what you said about starting from a problem, seeing a situation, being able to respond to that and use adversary simulation to kind of tease out a better understanding of that problem, but also a solution going forward. And I think it kind of aligns with what Steve said. If you can kind of start with a problem, you can start from intel saying, here's this threat. It seems really interesting to us. We should probably build an assessment based on this. Or the other side of what Steve said of, let's just look internally, look in a mirror and say, what do I not want to happen from a business justification? What's our doomsday? Operationally, what's the worst thing that happened to us, whether it's, impact or exfiltration of data, et cetera, et cetera. And let's build scenarios based on that. And it does really align with one of the questions that just came in on, how do we, and I think the question kind of the gist of it is, how do you make sure that adversary simulation just isn't wasting time or hurting feelings or making people kind of question, all the work they've done leading up to this point? And I think it really boils down, I'm interested in your perspective here as well, but I think it really boils down to the metrics, making sure, as we go through the simulation, we have expectations. We know what we're trying to answer. But there's also metrics that we can capture delineation that might be unknown. Like, hey, I didn't, maybe going into it, we're trying to test, the hunting team or something. And along that process, we learned, the breadth of data that they're collecting. We started learning things about visibility. We started learning things about analytic coverage. It maybe necessarily wasn't our exact intent, but we were able to tease out more data. And, as long as we're spinning everything towards, circling back to that Venn diagram in the beginning, actually improving defenses, it's kind of hard. There's so much wealth and so much power in these results and all this data we're capturing that, as long as everyone kind of keeps the, eye toward the prize of actually making things better, there really is no time for egos and stuff. No one's doing anything perfect. If we solve cyber, none of us would be here. So really my perspective is, just keep focusing on, let's make this assessment what it is. Let's understand what's going on. Let's see, what we expected versus what we're seeing. And let's figure out how to, remediate gaps and, I potentially identify opportunities for innovation and improvement in the future. Anything you wanted to add to, how do you personally make sure that, no one walks away from assessment with their head down and kind of in a, hopefully, unfortunately, in like an Eeyore kind of state?
I think you were right on the money, kind of leading with metrics, Jamie, because what that does is it allows the red team to very clearly communicate, this is what we're going to be measuring you based on. These are the behaviors we're going to run to kind of get that data. And but just by going through that, you're very transparently indicating what you're going to do on the network. And that could go a long way towards fostering additional trust. Beyond that, it's pretty common that we get network owners that are very wary of a red team coming into their environment. They don't want us to air out their dirty laundry, shed light on things that they're not very happy about. And usually the way I try to rectify that, it comes down to trust and transparency. I make it very clear from the beginning that we as red team are there to help, to make them better. And in some cases, we found that we could actually, our findings could actually become a vehicle for getting additional resources. In other words, you find all these issues in the network. Maybe you need more staff. Maybe you need new technology. We could be a vehicle to kind of help make those improvements. So the bottom line is be transparent about what you're going to do in the environment, about those metrics you're going to collect, and try and earn that trust with the network owner to show that you are there to help.
I love that answer too, because it's like you said before, not just putting the red team and the blue team in the same room. It's merging from a thought perspective, from an action perspective, and having participated in some great purple teams that Steve put on, I think it went exactly like that, where it's, hey, we all came in with a role, but towards the end we had the blue teamers and the hunters, suggesting good ideas for, hey, the red team should do this, or here's a variation you guys should execute. And the same thing, we had red teamers hovering over Splunk dashboards. We don't know the syntax, but we're like, oh, like this analytic would be really cool. Steve, anything else you wanted to add in terms of having puppeteered really great purple teams? How would you kind of make sure that everyone's kind of comfortable and there's no hard feelings or maybe some love lost during this experience?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think what we managed to do with that is we framed it as, this is an activity to help the blue side get better. It's not evaluate what you've already done. Like, you do your best, and then we'll come in and test you. It's more, we're here to help you get better. And so that, I think the collaborative feeling is really important. And I think what we've actually managed to frame those things up so that the blue team feels empowered at the end. They feel more capable by the end of it than they did at the beginning, because they didn't view it as a one-off test. They viewed it as an iterative thing where the adversary emulation is saying, okay, here are your few weak points. We're going to now give you the information you need to get better. You do that thing, and then we're going to do it again and see how that worked out. And then we're going to do it again. And we keep going. And by the end, if you're doing that right, the blue team is better. And they feel more competent and knowledgeable because they've seen how the adversary emulation team does it. And they might get some insights into things that they thought were working that aren't. But I think in the end, the net effect tends to be that they feel empowered because they're not only do they now have new analytics or new mitigations in place that they didn't before, and now they know that they will work because of that adversary emulation. But also, I think most of those groups have felt like we can now go repeat this. We can keep doing this. Every time we have a new defensive idea, we can have adversary emulation come in and help us refine and improve and test that out.
And I love that too, because I was thinking back to the metrics and kind of the output that you sent in summary of those engagements, but also it aligns with one of the questions we saw in the chat was, use the metrics to tell a story, but that story is focusing on the future, showing, this is how much improvement we made. This is how the opportunities we open going forward, and kind of looking forward. So it kind of has a very positive spin of, that net yield you mentioned of, hey, this was an engagement. Maybe we found some problems. We hopefully, can speak towards how we fix those. But here's all the great stuff, all the different things that we can do in future iterations. But there was another side of that question that I wanted to circle back to you, actually both of you on, was, so say during an assessment, you do find something that's a critical bug or something that maybe has, more grave consequences. How do you go about safely, within the confines of adversarial emulation and purple teaming, disclosing that, sharing that with the customer, but also, translating that lesson learned out to a broader community? Say, you do something, there's some misconfiguration that, maybe is something that, not necessarily a CVE, but kind of a common, config issue or some other hiccup that you do want to work with that customer because they're the, the focus, they're the prime, you want to make them. But how do you kind of translate that lesson, externally to other people to kind of, transitively pick up on that benefit without maybe disclosing too much about the original kind of subject? I think I'll start with Mike. I see some light bulbs tinkering a little bit. It might be right up your alley.
Yeah. This is something that we have encountered repeatedly in the past. I'm reminded of a couple of instances. There was one where we were basically assessing a space mission architecture, and we found one of those critical vulnerabilities that could be really bad in adversary hands. Way we disclosed it, I guess, the first thing I'll say is we first demonstrated that it actually worked, because the network owners were really skeptical. This network's bulletproof. There's no way you could get it. Well, we showed how you could actually get it. And we tried to do it in a positive way too. Basically, we involved the network owner. We said, hey, come watch us. We're going to test this particular exploit. And I'll even add that we neutered the exploit, right? Like the weaponized version just had a simple reverse shell callback. The network owner was really risk averse. We rolled it back, so all it did is plant a file. So first we defanged the exploit to make the network owner feel a little bit safer about it. So we demonstrated it worked, and once the network owner, agreed, yeah, that works, it's a true positive. We actually brought in the device vendor, the vendor that manufactures this device we were looking at. We actually brought them into the room, and we were talking face to face. And we're talking about really severe exploits and vulnerabilities. Not necessarily something you want to email in plain text over unsecure channels. So we fell back on face to face. We were all local. So we talked to each other like humans and said, this is the vulnerability. This is the exploit. We'd already had mitigation information available. We basically empowered both the network owner and the vendor with all the information they needed in order to affect corrective changes. Now, the vendor was actually empowered to push an emergency patch within 24 hours to all of their customers in response to this particular finding. And we did it in such a way that it'd be really kind of difficult to identify or to weaponize an exploit on any unpatched systems. So summarizing all of that, it was a combination of just being transparent about our findings and our activities, working with both the network owners and the vendors to effect corrective patches.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I love how, the theme I kept picking up on was your use of empower, like looking for who is the right person. It's not just, fun facts and talking trash about, a customer or what, et cetera, but finding the actual people who can make a difference. +1 for SneakerNet as well. But Steve, anything you wanted to add there? Or,
I think I love the answer. I think that it touches on a general principle of like responsible disclosure. You're finding something bad, disclose it to the people who can fix it before you disclose it to the people who are going to exploit it. I think another common general principles that I found is that usually the sensitive things are not the things that other people care about anyway. And so if you can extract those two, right? So the fact that it was this organization, that it was this particular, vendor, it was this particular mission, that's usually what people are embarrassed about sharing and don't want shared. But that's also what no one else cares about because they don't care that, oh, this other company had an issue. What they want to know is there something I need to do in my systems to make myself more secure? And usually that's the kind of information that the other company doesn't view as sensitive. So I think generally what we try to do is separate those two kinds of information from each other and say, for you, to the organization or to the vendor, here's the full details, of course. But then here are some general best practices, kind of security principles that now we can share with everybody, and we just don't associate it with you.
Makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I've seen in my experience that kind of come to fruition with, exactly as Mike said, and exactly as you said, there's some problem. We saw it. We were able to hopefully fix it. But we were also able to iterate, as you said earlier, and say, hey, now that we know this, let's re-execute an adversary simulation that is, either, kind of tailored towards that problem to kind of make sure, all the bricks are in line, there's no kind of leaks in the wall, or just kind of exaggerate the power and exaggerate the value of what we just did. Like, hey, this would have worked had this not been fixed. We don't need to know all the details of where this came from and why, but here's a really good idea. And here's a plan that kind of exaggerates all the yield that you'll kind of get from fixing this problem. I do see some really great questions coming in. And funny enough, a lot of these are actually addressed by our next slide. So I'm going to actually pick up with proceeding on our slide deck here. And I think we've already touched on this one quite a bit, but one of the biggest things, me personally, and I imagine both of you as well, is we've experienced with people adopting adversary emulation and purple teaming and these kind of very, very nuanced assessment approaches, is there is a lot of more, kind of cost of entry, and a lot more investment needing to actually get started. In the case of adversary emulation, we can talk about, adversary emulation ends up better the better intel you have. If you have a team that's actually finding great intel, parsing it, not just finding, hey, this actor has done this, but, all those tough questions you need as an actual, offensive engineer building a plan. Like, how are they doing it? What are they doing it? What's the sequencing looking like? Can I see command lines? All of that's going to go better and kind of build a better adversary emulation plan. But also the back end of that is, not just, we all have access to these, great tooling. There's a wealth of, capabilities, some of which we've talked about today that kind of help and aid adversary emulation. But, the better, being able to actually sit down and tailor, like Steve said, bespoke tools, saying, hey, this actor does it very particular way. Let's sit down and kind of tailor, existing tooling or build our own stuff to kind of replicate those behaviors and generate the telemetry we need to actually, kind of play ball with those exact behaviors. Unfortunately, this is something that, can seem daunting, especially as a small shop. You might not have, full-time analyst or anyone who has a background in offensive development or, any of that stuff. But, the yield of this is, on the back end, if you're able to make it through that gauntlet, stable, repeatable plans, we'll show examples of these later, but something that you can, it's hardened, and hopefully something that you can, execute today, tomorrow, next year, adapt to different environments, adapt it to different use cases. And that's actually one of the big benefits of this and kind of practice in general is, it's almost like a build once, use many times situation, where even in our situation, we're building these plans, we can, hopefully cut into the cost of adversary simulation for you, because, I'll show it in a minute, but we're publishing plans, we're sharing them. Other people are doing very similar. And these are things that, even if you don't have all the staff and the resources to kind of start from zero, you can start from us. Grab our plan, adopt it to your environment, take a look at those questions that we talked about in terms of what do you want to assess, what questions do you want to answer, what kind of data do you want to poke out, and kind of look at our plan and align that with, how could this potentially be fixed? Do you have the cycles to maybe augment it? So one thing that I wanted to touch on was, Mike and Steve, how much do you see, the state of, I think someone even asked it in the chat, the state of sharing this type of knowledge? What do you see on the forecast and kind of on the horizon in terms of what we can do better, but also how to just get more people involved in kind of building this community and maintaining this, but also the fun, spicy side of making sure it's used responsibly and it's falling in the right hands, and it's kind of pushing towards building and promoting cybersecurity, defenses, vice, operationalizing, and maybe having another ill effect.
I think we're fortunate in that there's already a lot of really useful existing resources for adversary emulation. A few that come to mind include Center for Threat Informed Defense Adversary Emulation Library. We know that Attack Evaluations publishes emulation plans. Other capabilities like Caldera, Scythe, they have emulation plans you can draw from. And then there's frameworks like Atomic Red Team, which is really good just to kind of get started with kind of a lightweight framework or capability. So it's great that we have all of these existing capabilities. Where things can get kind of challenging. One is if your capability is really, really good, it's entirely possible that real world adversaries might start using it. One of our former colleagues was a contributor of the Donut framework, and months after him showing it to us, we started seeing articles of real world adversaries using it in the wild. So that's a big challenge. If you write effective red team tools, real world adversaries might start using it. And to that, I say, well, you still kind of put the pendulum in favor of defenders, right? Because if you're publicly releasing your capabilities in your source code, defenders could then go study it and mitigate, that adversary use. Whereas with proprietary software, maybe they don't have that level of introspection to allow a proactive response. So there's a lot of benefit in just having the code out there so that if adversaries start using it, we could intelligently respond to it. I don't know, Steve, if you had any particular thoughts.
Yeah. From a defensive perspective and the purple team per se. So for purple teaming, I think that we've gotten the most value if we can have a really clear articulation of exactly what the adversary emulation team did and what the defensive team did, what was detected and what was missed, and what were false positives. Because those are the kinds of metrics that are really going to be actionable for the defensive team and for the adversary emulation team at the end, and throughout. So if you've run 6 techniques and I detected 4, I want to know about those 2 that I missed so that I can focus my defensive development work on those 2. You might want to look at the 4 that I caught and see if there are other ways to implement those and with staying within what threat intel supports. And then I also want to look at, maybe I caught 4 of the techniques, but maybe one of them was only caught by an analytic that was also giving me 100 false positives, for the one true positive that I got. So I kind of need all 3 of those metrics so that I can see, the true positives, the false positives, and the false negatives, so that then I can steer my efforts and I can make that high false positive analytic maybe more precise and filter out some of the noise. And for the false negatives, I need to do some maybe new data collection or some new analytic development. And that gives me also something repeatable for the next time, because I'm going to want to go close those gaps. And then I want you to come back and be able to rerun the same thing so that I can check whether what I just did worked or not and how well. For defenses and sharing, the stuff that comes out of it, I think it'd be great to get to the point where we are with like public key cryptography, where we don't have to keep the defensive thing secret. That is just strong in and of itself. And I think there's actually some value even in just having defensive ideas out there, because that in and of itself might force adversaries to change, to avoid things, even if they're not fully implemented in every target system. But it's sort of similar to what I said about the sensitive versus useful. I think that for sensing configuration of like Sysmon and Windows Event Logging, and also with analytics, there are components of those two things that are generic and probably useful to lots of different people. And then there are going to be components that are unique to your situation. And so they won't be very useful to others, but they're also kind of sensitive. So if you can separate those two, like for example, if I've got an analytic that, I've got, tuned up, like, hey, if I look for these two event codes and I have this query running, I'll see that technique occur. But maybe that in and of itself is generating a lot of false positives. And I've had some like 3 exclusions from my network to block out those false positives. So maybe the exclusions I keep to myself, but I publish, looking at these events and running this query, you will at least see the bad stuff. And FYI, you might need to tune out some false positives, but I don't need to share, exactly this path is what I'm excluding in my production network, because then that's too vulnerable to an adversary to evade.
I love that answer in terms of, just how powerful and kind of the ROI on, actually sitting down, building a plan is the repeatability, being able to measure it, in different environments, different, situations, the same organization over time, especially when you're measuring something like, imagine a process where it's like, hey, how quick does our remediation team, are they able to fix bugs and kind of respond to incidents? But one thing I wanted to circle back on that you mentioned was really interesting, Steve, was, I think Mike even kind of implied this in a lot of senses too, is how this purple teaming, how this assessment really is, it takes a family, it takes a village where, we're not just talking about red and blue anymore. Mike mentioned vendors, you mentioned, procurement and, all these decision makers. But really my question for you was, I think one of the first things you kind of touched on was, the important metrics. But you, as having facilitated and kind of seen purple teaming success, how do you go about enabling, that shot calibration of, red teams come, like, Mike and I come in with, we have our plan, we've mapped it to attack or whatever, we know what techniques we're going to execute. How do you actually facilitate making sure all that's communicated over so that, you can do that, misses versus hits versus, and kind of actually make sure you're kind of seeing the evaluation for what it is?
Yeah, well, we've learned that is actually pretty complicated. It's a lot more nuanced and difficult than it seems at first. So for one, we try to plan ahead and have a solid understanding by all participants about what techniques are about to be employed and what's the game plan. What are we going after, right? Because the blue side needs to understand what they're trying to accomplish, right? And if they don't know what the adversary emulators are doing, then this kind of anything goes. So if you can narrow that down and say we're running this actor, or we're running this set of techniques, or maybe even just this one technique is one way we've done it many times, that can really help. One thing that to keep in mind is that what the adversary emulation team does might be different from what the defenders see. So you might run a command, and as a result of that command, the operating system takes 1,000 actions, right? It touches registry keys and files, and it sets things up, and all kinds of second order effects occur that the adversary emulators might not even be aware of. And yet those might be the things that are triggering the events that are going into the seam and the defenders are seeing. So the defender will say, I think I just caught you. And they'll show you something and you're like, well, is that even me, right? And so having that collaborative environment is very important at that point. This is not as simple as something that could just be automated, I think. And the adversary emulators and the blue team both have to sort of learn about each other's world, right? To facilitate that communication. So the adversary emulators see the second order effects and start getting familiar with these event codes and what kinds of fields they have and all of that. And the blue teamers are seeing like, oh, that's the command you're running. And that's triggering this thing to happen, which triggers that thing. And then they learn a lot more about how to write solid analytics and do that investigation after they get an initial detection.
So I tried to choreograph like this slide, and for anyone watching, this was not scripted. I think Steve, you basically just covered this slide to a T. So big thank you. But yeah, it's exactly that. And I think there's a question in the chat that we can actually use to kind of scope and frame this question is there's no, there's no minimum size or, some prerequisite to doing this. It's really just thinking about the problem in a particular way. This could be one person, this could be 1,000 people. It's really, as Steve said, being able to kind of, dive in. This is, by the way, not a formal model. This is just some slide we put together, but it really just captures a lot of the thought that goes into actually executing this and pulling this off is, starting with understanding those questions, exactly as Steve said, making sure, we've kind of baked the questions into what we're actually going to do. We're able to see and track the problem as it's being, executed, learn, validate and kind of learn from what we expected, but go off and see all those, that operating system, 1,000 new events and artifacts we didn't expect, and actually exploit those, reap the reward, say, hey, no one, until we actually executed it, no one really knows exactly what will happen. Maybe there's some, fancy tool you didn't know was relevant. Maybe there's some tool you didn't even know you applied in your environment that, kind of, butts its head up and shows its value. But one thing I wanted to touch on here, I think Steve did an excellent job kind of highlighting the back end of this process. But Mike, from your experience, mostly on the, focusing on the planning and the implementation of these TTPs, what are some big considerations that you can kind of share with folks in terms of, exactly as we're talking about showing up to the purple team with everything that Steve and the blue team and everyone kind of looking for, value here? What can you do to make sure you're kind of doing your part and actually, being a good participant in this, collaborative experiment?
Well, at the highest level, the first thing I want to make sure is that there is shared understanding of the goals of that particular project. Are we assessing some technology to maybe inform purchasing decisions? Are we looking at technology just to see kind of how it measures up against real world adversaries? There's a lot of different considerations that go into it. Once there's shared understanding of the goal of the project, it's a lot more intuitive to figure out how do we properly plan and implement this so that this is good use of time, it's productive and impactful. Usually, what that comes down to is, what are the goals of the project? How much time do we have to get it done? How much resources do we have to work with? As a comparison for attack evaluations, it's likely that we might have 3 to 4 months to implement a really high fidelity adversary emulation plan. Compare that to a smaller project where maybe it's a week long engagement. You probably don't have 30 days to spend implementing an adversary emulation plan to that level. So once you kind of know what your constraints are, that basically just gives you enough to start planning for something that's realistic and achievable. If I've got a really small amount of time, a small amount of resources, I'm going to maximize using existing capabilities. It might be taking some TTPs from Atomic Red Team, wrapping them into something like Metasploit or Cobalt Strike, just enough to kind of meet those basic mission requirements. If you have more time and resources, yeah, make a bespoke adversary emulation plan that's as realistic as possible to those adversary TTPs the network owner compares about. So it's all about knowing what are your goals, what are your constraints, your timelines, and so on. Once you have all that clearly understood, just communicate the plan to your teammates, to the network owners, and it just becomes a matter of show up, get it done, deal with any problems that you have along the way. And hopefully, through that collaboration, you could have a successful project at the end of it.
Yeah, and I love that answer. It's like, it doesn't matter if you have 6 months, a year, 2 days, 30 minutes. It's really the same approach model, so you can scale it, in, out, to kind of fit whatever you need. Great insight there. Thank you. So going, sorry.
Just amplify on that a little bit, because I think really purple teaming is almost like a nonstop continuous type of thing, in that when I'm researching a technique and developing my very first analytic ideas very early on, I'll be implementing the technique myself in like a little mini purple team where it's just me on my own machine, right? And then, Jamie and Michael, as you know, I'll reach out to you and say, what do you think of this, right? And it's just like a verbal purple team, right? Where you'll give me some info back and we go back and forth. And then maybe we'll do a virtual purple team. Then maybe you have a purple team in like a little subset of your network. Then maybe you go to the full scale production, because the costs go up and up and up as you go down that spectrum. And so you want to kind of learn as much as you can for as cheap as you can, as early as you can, right? And so use that whole spectrum to kind of keep, and if you're keeping the adversary emulation team in the loop while you're developing your blue ideas, That's only going to make this final purple team that much better, because they're going to deeply understand what you're trying to accomplish. You will have already gotten a better understanding as the blue team about what the adversary emulators can do, right? And sort of what that envelope looks like. And when you get into the actual event, you're both now focusing on the remaining gaps that need to be closed. And it can feel very collaborative.
And that's a powerful approach too, because like each one of those phases of that purple team development, you're asking different questions where, you with your, our conversations and such, or maybe just teasing out ideas, maybe scoping the problem. Maybe we go to a single host and we just see, let's get real data. Let's see what it looks like. And then as we kind of scale it out in the environment, let's see if this is actually scalable. Let's see, is this something we want to give to a SOC versus a hunt team, or kind of actually thinking about how we actually want to operationalize that. So even if it's the exact same plan as you're saying, there's so much, along that kind of timeline, so many different questions, so many different lessons that we can learn to kind of, make this reality versus just, a good idea that some folks are talking about on a lovely Wednesday afternoon. So I know we mentioned a couple of these already, but we wanted to walk through some helpful resources related to, this magical adversary emulation purple team thing. We will talk through a couple things that you can hopefully grab and use as for yourself. And then we'll conclude this with, some open-ended questions, back and forth between ourselves, as well as if people want to start queuing up questions, we can start to address those as well. But we've mentioned this a couple of times already. First thing we want to start with was the CTID Adversary Emulation Plan Library. As you can see, we've already mentioned this a couple of times. This is going to be a really great reference for, a starting point. If say you don't have, experience or the staff or resources or whatever it is to kind of, fully, start from scratch with adversary emulation, you can go to here and kind of just grab, these step-by-step guides we've already put together in terms of, here's what we've, examples of, us not only, building a plan, but maybe something that you can use in your environment, or just kind of steal and borrow the format, things that we've included in terms of intelligence summaries, defining an adversary, the actually way we format, here's how to set up, in the environment, and here's, the click by click, instructions of actually copying, pasting commands, and executing them in your environment, importing it into Caldera, and all those lessons learned, we're not, like I said before, we're not prescribing this as, this is the only way to do adversary emulation. If you're not doing this, you're not doing it the MITRE or the MITRE Ingenuity way. It's more, hey, here's what we're doing. Hopefully it's helpful for you. Feel free to use it. Feel free to, adapt it into your environment. But most importantly, it's exactly as we talked about before, starting those conversations, starting those lessons learned opportunities, and really kind of sharing the love. I think, Mike, you mentioned this one a little bit before as well. We also execute, both of us work on attack evaluations. Long story short, if you've never been familiarized with this project, basically a giant purple team. We sit down with various security vendors and we run adversary emulation plans against those products and document for public, consumption, how those products, defend against, various adversary groups. So this is a great example and a great data set for just looking at, not only, what could, the outputs of this look like in terms of how we document the behaviors we executed, the data we collect about each behavior, but also, just some interesting lessons, depending on where you are in this process of how to scope an evaluation, whether what we did for an ICS evaluation looks very different from what we did from an endpoint evaluation, from, services and deception, all the different things we have going on. Just kind of taking a look and appreciate the methodology and kind of the, like, as we said before, the thoughts that go into looking at, a technology or a process or a problem or an opportunity, and being able to say, how do I scope an evaluation to kind of answer those questions and tease out the data that makes me, better going forward. Another great resource, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk better about this one, but this is the Caldera project, where we have, are attempting to automate a lot of this work. Mike, any great insights or scoping you want to share for folks about Caldera?
Yeah, so Caldera is a freely available open source project. I would describe it as a adversary emulation framework that emphasizes autonomous execution and intelligent decision making. It's both an extensible plugin-based framework, which is to say you'll see a lot of different plugins that do different things. There's a blue team plugin that could do some threat hunting type activities. It integrates with the attack navigator. So you could go from the attack navigator to generating adversary profiles based on TTPs you select. So bottom line, Caldera is another adversary emulation framework, freely available. It does lots of cool things. So if you're looking for another tool to add to your kit, this is another great project to take a look at.
And one of the interesting things I've always, fascinated about Caldera was how it kind of, under the hood, and this is kind of a, third party speaking here, so correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but under the hood, it basically is a stockpile of abilities, basically, ability to execute a particular technique. And it can, either take your direction in terms of this is what you want to execute, tell me what, basically build a plan for me, and I'll go forth and do so. Or it has the ability under the hood to kind of do a little bit of its own magical logic and planning, saying, hey, this is, you want me to get domain admin, or you want me to move over to this box and, exfil data. Here's how I'm going to go about it. I'm not only going to execute those behaviors that I think are a good progression, but I'm going to course correct. And I think it also, that in itself is a lot of the fun of adversary emulation, is actually understanding that from a CTI perspective. So it really is awesome to automate that. But question I had for you, Mike, and something that just slipped in was, Caldera, in the context of Caldera, in the context of your own adversary emulation work, how do you manage, rabbit holes in terms of, in the case the question's asking, if you see a big vulnerability and it's like, oh, wow, like that's awesome. It's not necessarily in our plan, but that's interesting, and, kind of balancing that with, staying true to the CTI versus the realism of, hey, if a real adversary would have saw that, would they have, would a Fin7 or whoever you're emulating, would they have kind of, diverted whatever they're doing, whether it's like standard SOP or whatever, and kind of, attack that? How do you kind of manage those trade-offs?
Yeah, so it really comes down to three specific criteria I have. Pretty much the first, which is at the forefront of my mind, is this particular thing in scope and aligned with my rules of engagement? If it's not, that doesn't mean it's off the table, but it does mean you need to have a conversation with the network owners about it. So, yeah, step one is it aligned with scope and ROE? Step two is it aligned with the engagement objectives? Is there going to be some value or return on security investment for the network owner if we go and exploit or otherwise pursue this thing? And then third is kind of where I weigh it against CTI. Is this aligned with kind of how this particular adversary has acted in the past? And all that is to say, the answers to these things might be no, but that's not to say you shouldn't do it maybe at a later time. Maybe finish your immediate testing now, flag that as something to come back and revisit during retesting if the schedule allows for it. If not, maybe try and set up a follow-on engagement to go look at that thing that you think might be of some benefit to the network owner. At the end of the day, I'm looking at those three criteria. You kind of deal with it on a case-by-case basis. If the network owner stands to gain impactful value from it, it's definitely worth proposing it to them and letting them decide whether they want to do it or not.
The two big takeaways I'm taking is communication, iteration. So, yeah, big thank you. Steve, I think you were going to weigh in on that as well.
I was just going to say I had a situation where we were going from IT to OT in a purple team. And so the question was, how much of a physical effect are we allowed to have in the adversary emulation part of this? And so, we were talking with the system owners, and we said, well, we can accomplish the blue team objective of being able to detect that it's happening with like a small effect, right? But the humans on the other end might not notice it. So do you just want to check that the hunt team can detect it, or are you trying to make a point to the humans that this physical thing could happen based on a cyber activity? And so I think that really gets to the engagement objectives that Michael was talking about, right? What are you trying to do here? Are you trying to just help develop an analytic, in which case maybe a small effect is sufficient? Or are you trying to make this showy so that the non-cyber people in the chain of command kind of get a message?
All leading back to that planning and scoping, like you said. I love the mentions of the ROE and like, why are we doing this? We're not just here to kind of, light the dumpster on fire. What's our mission objective? What are we trying to achieve? Keeping going forward, this wouldn't be, a MITRE Ingenuity talk about, attack related things. We didn't mention Navigator. So if you're not familiar, Navigator is a tool that enables us to, in the spirit of what we talked about today, capturing metrics, enables us to annotate, attack, actually build what we call our own layers, our own representative views of the framework, whether we're, down selecting from certain platforms or highlighting different techniques and overlaying that with our own notes and our own kind of, logic or anything else we want to capture. Attack Navigator is really going to enable us to, bring attack closer to our operation in terms of, this is just a really notional graph, but as you can see, I'm able to, highlight certain parts of attack, whether it's things that I care about, things that, we are assessing, things the blue team saw, things the red team saw. Attack Navigator is really going to help us kind of tell that story and paint the picture in the language of attack. Final resource we want to talk about, and this is a little bit, one interesting to me. I've been exposed to this, but I wanted to turn it over to Steve to kind of talk about maybe a different perspective. And this kind of gets a little bit closer to, what we talked about with threat modeling and actually, those questions on how do we pick an adversary and how do we actually, kind of apply that to our assessment. This is the TTP-based hunting paper. So Steve, can you give us a little background about this and how it kind of relates to this purple team adversary emulation?
Yeah, so to go back to my Elmer the Elephant comment, this paper was developed by Roman Dashashak, Sean Whitley, Dan Ellis, and me with input from others as well. So this is a team effort. And the idea is that this V diagram kind of shows us a methodology where we start in the upper left with knowledge of the adversary's behavior, and we recommend using attack for that first step. And then you kind of developed a hypothesis around what that would look like and how you would detect it. Then you determine what data you would need to see to detect that activity. You filter that down for what's relevant for your network. You identify your collection, current collection status, see what gaps there are, and then try to mitigate those. Then you implement those analytics as concrete things. So over on the left, we're like pseudocode, English language kind of stuff. On the right, now maybe it's Splunk or it's a Kibana query. And instead of saying process create, we're going to say 4688 or sysmon1, or, we're getting specific now. And this is really where the purple teaming comes into play from the hunter's perspective, right? So from the hunter's perspective, we've gone through all these steps already. And we're like at the point where we're ready to test out if our ideas are going to work in the real world. And as I said before, this is an iterative process, this V. And so you're going through it multiple times. And at the beginning, it's sort of with yourself. And then maybe it's, like I said, it's verbally with a Jamie or a Michael. But you eventually get to this point where you do like a full-blown purple teaming activity. And so you've got specific hypotheses that you're trying to test. You've got specific queries and analytics that you're trying to test out. And so from the hunter's perspective, I want the adversary emulation team to now come in here and run all that through its paces, right? And so the next slide actually touches on some of these things from the hunter's perspective of like, what am I getting out of the purple teaming? So for one, I'm getting true positives. I could do research and put analytics in my environment all day long, but if there's no actual malicious activity, I might be getting no hits, and I don't know whether that means I've written a good analytic or not. And so I need the adversary emulators to come in there and give me some real true positives to deal with so that I can validate that, yes, if this bad thing happens, my analytic will catch it, right? My mitigation will stop it. And so I need the adversary emulation to help me validate that, because for most of the time, hopefully, I'm not going to be getting any hits. And I want to have that foundational confidence to say, I'm not getting any hits, and that means it's not happening, right? Versus I'm not getting any hits and I've never gotten any hits. And so who knows whether this is even a valid analytic. So that's extremely valuable to the blue team. Also, Jamie and Michael, you two, but also everyone on the Caldera team that I've worked with, everyone from this perspective, they bring a different mindset to this than what the analytic developers bring, right? You have a deep, deep understanding of how a bunch of different adversaries have implemented these techniques. You understand, all the different levers you can pull and the knobs you can tweak to vary up how this thing occurs. And if I show you my analytic, you might be able to immediately say, I can evade that. Because you know about something that I don't know about, or you have that sort of creative mindset and expertise that the analytic developer might not have. And so that's valuable throughout this process of bringing that, think evil kind of mentality. But it's also sort of this creative expertise kind of mentality. And so in my purple teams that I run, I like to have the adversary emulators execute a given technique in a bunch of different procedural implementations so that I'm verifying that my defense is not brittly dependent on one procedural thing. So for example, I might run Caldera and I run 12 different techniques and I catch them all. And it's great. I've got one analytic. It just looks for PowerShell with exec bypass, argument, and I've caught everything. And so I might think I can catch 12 different techniques with 100% recall, but really I've honed in on one little artifact of one particular tool and how it's implementing it. And so I want the adversary emulator to really push the envelope with me, and I want to kind of go back and forth with them to validate the robustness of my analytic approach. You bring the realism of Intel to me in a way that the defender might not have off the bat. So, it's easy for me to go down the rabbit hole while I'm researching and say, oh, and I could do this, and I could do this, and I could do this. And the emulator is usually going to come in with that perspective of, yeah, but these are the ways that actual adversaries do it. And so for one, maybe I can relax about some of those other like more theoretical things. But it also helps me focus, like, okay, these are my top priorities then, and I need to really focus on those. And
it's all about bringing the perspectives together. Love it. Yes,
it is. And that's the last bullet, the two-way street, right? So, Jamie, you and I had such a good time on that first purple team, the sleigh ride that we did, of just back and forth. And I feel like we were both learning. And that was true of, I think, everyone in that room. Caldera was developing new abilities. I think you were implementing things in new ways. The hunters were pushing themselves and they were developing new analytics. And as a result, we came up with some actually new things that are now in CAR as a result of that activity. And Caldera is a more capable thing as a result. So I think it's really important to remember that you get the best benefit when it is a two-way collaboration and it doesn't come across as the red team is here to test you and they are perfect and they're just going to assess you. But let's share information in both directions. And I think we can up the game on both sides of the house.
I think there's a Sesame Street reference there under the hood as well. But I think we're coming on time. But so we maybe only have time for one question. I know we prepared a couple, but we'll be available in the booth following this. But I think this is a good kind of capstone question of each of you 30 seconds. How do you structure a purple team to maximize the benefit? I think we'll start with Mike.
Really, it comes down to having mechanisms for trust, transparency, and communication. A lot of that kind of starts with the red team getting the network owners to kind of trust you. Usually to do that, you're very clear about what TTPs you're going to run, what metrics you're measuring against, and then fostering that communication. It's either putting people in a room, creating that mindset, or if we're working remote, make sure that there's an all-day Teams call for people to dial in and kind of talk about what each team is doing. So trust, transparency, and communication.
Love it. Steve?
Yeah, so I have a kind of a standard structure that I've used many times now, which is that we agree ahead of time, these are the techniques that we're going to execute. And there's the adversary emulators, there's the blue team, and there's like the white cell that is running the show, has full visibility on both sides all the time, and is observing. And so what we do is we say, okay, we're going to brief you on this technique as the defenders, right? This is what the technique is. We go through the attack page on it. We talk about detection ideas. We give them, here are the event codes that you might look at. This is the kind of network traffic, port numbers associated with it. Here are some of the analytics that are already in Sigma and CAR and EQL-lib, et cetera, right? Prime them up with as much information as possible so that we want the blue team prepared to do as well as they can, even on the first round, right? And then we say, okay, now the adversary emulators are going to emulate it. And we start with the loudest simplest implementation of that technique. It's a morale boost for the blue team, and it's a great way to start. It gives them a hook, right? Then we share back and forth, and if the blue team is succeeding, we share kind of back to the adversary emulators, and they say, okay, I think I can beat that, right? And they implement it again in maybe a more evasive way. And if the blue team is stalling out, then we share from the adversary emulation side over to the blue team, and we kind of use the asymmetry to determine which direction does information need to flow right now. And we kind of just gradually turn the dials until we've kind of explored all the implementation approaches for that technique. And the blue team is feeling very confident in their approach. Ideally, we get to the point where the adversary emulators basically throw up their hands and they say, okay, you got me. I can't figure out a way to evade this.
I love it. Systematic baby steps to victory. Yeah, and short and sweet from my perspective. And I think you both have already kind of captured the nuance of this. Is it's just come in learning, being know what you know, be very confident what you know, make sure you're able to most importantly communicate what you know, but also be willing to just kind of absorb different perspectives, even if you 100% don't initially agree. There's a reason people share the things they do. Kind of understand why are they saying that. Maybe it's true in their reality, and you just haven't really fully appreciated their perspective yet. But with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Great session. So thank you both, obviously, and thanks. I'll at least myself, I'll see you over in the booth, and we will cede control over to Steve and the rest of the lovely show. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jamie and Michael. Jamie, that was an outstanding job facilitating. Loved it. You really got the best out of us and contributed so much. Thank you both. Our next session is going to be with Rich and John and Michael Kormidas, who are going to talk about the Center for Threat Informed Defense and what they've been doing in this area. So I look forward to seeing you at the next session.